All around, on every side and every direction, the vast machinery of Commonwealth clashed and thundered. From dawn to dark, and from dark till dawn. Here, of all of her cities, throbbed the true life, the true power and spirit of America. Novelist Frank Norris. The years during and after the Civil War were very good to Chicago. And leading into 1871, Chicago was a boom town, the fastest growing city in the history of the world and the fourth largest city in America. It was a swampy patch of land, 6 miles long and 3 miles wide. And when it was incorporated in 1837, there were 5,000 residents. Now it contained a teeming mass of over 300,000 people, mostly immigrants, all looking to achieve their American dream. The novelist Henry B. Fuller captured the character of the city when he said Chicago was the only great city in the world to which all of its citizens have come for the one common avowed object of making money. It was a city of industry, energy, motion, constant motion. In 1848, the shipping canal opened, connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi. With it, Chicago became the largest grain, pork, and lumber market in the nation. By 1870, more ships docked in Chicago than New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, San Francisco, Charleston, and Mobile combined. But that same year, Chicago had bet its future on another type of transportation, the railroads. By 1857, it was the rail center of America. In 1871, over 100 passenger trains entered or left the city every day.
You could almost call it a scam. In 1871, if you're traveling out west from the east, you couldn't get past Chicago without stopping here first, often overnight. And this was great for the commercial and the criminal enterprises in the city.
Besides the passenger trains, even more freight trains passed through the city daily. They brought 16 million bushels of wheat to be stored in the giant grain elevators along the river. Stock cars supplied the Union stockyards with animals, and the 21 meat packing houses processed the meat. Along with being the largest lumber market, Chicago became the center for the manufacture of wood furniture. Chicago was an important place for the buying, storing, selling, and shipping of goods. It may have been an important place, but still a frontier town, where tourists, farmers, immigrants, businessmen passed through the city daily. And being a wide-open city, it was paradise for the grifters, gamblers, pickpockets, and prostitutes that preyed on those temporary visitors. Geographically, the river divided the city into 3 main parts. The South Division contained the main business district, the most expensive buildings in the city totaling half the entire property value of the city. It also contained some of the worst slums and vice districts in the city, including Connolly Patch. Described in a newspaper as a collection of the dirtiest, vilest, most rickety, one-sided, leaning forward, propped up, tumble down, sinking fast, low-roof, miserable shanties. The North Division was home to the city's finest residential district, where a mix of Irish, German, and Swedish immigrants built their homes alongside some of Chicago's earliest settlers. Across the T of the river was the West Division. Industrial areas dotted the riverbank, surrounded by working-class immigrant neighborhoods, barely a step up above the slums in the South Division. They provided the cheap labor that moved the industry machine. To the awe of their out-of-town guests, Chicagoans proudly showed off the grand buildings that made up the business district, buildings of sturdy brick, stone, and Athens marble. But Chicago was presenting a false front. The Tribune described many of the buildings that dotted the business district as fire traps, pleasing to the eye, nothing more than shams and shingles built by swindling contractors. Chicago was a city almost entirely made of wood. The brick buildings were often no more than a facade, 1 brick thick around a wooden frame. And what the Chicago tour guides failed to reveal to their out-of-town guests was that Athens marble was really limestone from Athens, Illinois. Even buildings of more substantial stuff and advertised to be fireproof, almost without exception had wooden floors, wooden window frames, and wooden door frames. Buildings were adorned with cheap, flimsy wood cornices, decorated to look like stone and poorly secured. In some areas, they fell on pedestrians with alarming regularity. The buildings had long wooden signs, mansard top stories of wood, wooden roofs covered with felt, tar, or shingles. Interspersed with these fine buildings were dozens of wooden houses, stables, saloons. The shops and warehouses were full of aisle upon aisle of wooden shelves and cases, filled with mostly flammable products. There were 55 miles of pine block streets, wooden blocks, coated in coal tar, and set in the streets like paving stones. There were 600 miles of raised wooden sidewalks that bound the city in a highly combustible knot.
You can think of fire almost as a living creature. It needs to eat and it needs to breathe. The area underneath the raised sidewalks, some as high as 5 feet, provided the air to breathe. The leaves, refuse, dried horse manure that collected underneath the sidewalks, that was the fuel to eat.
Outside the central business district, there were warehouses, manufacturing plants, shack saloons, flop houses, the rotting shanties of the poor, everything made of wood. The grease and oil-slicked river was traversed by a dozen wooden bridges, filled with wooden ships and lined with combustibles. There are 17 5-story tall grain elevators, tall wooden chimneys bursting with flammable grain. There were lumber yards, woodworking factories. Not only the raw materials, wood and varnish, flammable, but more dangerous was their waste, the sawdust and the wood chips, which was ignited by the smallest spark. To run the steam engines that moved the industry machine, there are mountains of coal in their yards. Every home had its own stock of kerosene for lighting, coal and wood for heating and cooking. It might be said with considerable justice that Chicago specialized in the production, handling, and storage of combustible goods. The great Chicago historian Alfred T. Andreas wrote, "Chicago was then built as if to invite its destruction in this manner." In 1870 alone, there were over 600 reported fires. The fire department repeatedly asked for a building inspection department to be formed, metal roof requirements for hotels or other large buildings, more fire hydrants, larger water mains, fire boats with powerful pumps, more firemen. Each and every request was denied by city government that insisted that higher taxes and stricter regulations would stifle business. Chicago's 18 square miles would be protected by 185 firemen on call 24 hours a day, and 17 relatively new horse-drawn steam engines that could pump 600 to 900 gallons a minute on a fire. In addition, there are 23 hose carts, 4 hook and ladders, and 2 hose elevators. A telegraph network of 172 alarm boxes spiderwebbed the city. These were placed on corners or businesses. They were locked to prevent false alarms, the keys given to nearby citizens deemed trustworthy. There is a pumping station and water tower that supplies a system of hydrants a steady stream of water from Lake Michigan. They bragged that the entire lake could be pumped into the city if need be.
The city's fire defenses were bigger and more up to date than most cities. They were good, but really spread much too thin. The department was also lucky. They arrived at the fires quickly, but there was no margin for error.
Throughout the summer of 1871, Chicago had experienced the second year of the worst drought anyone could remember. Less than 5 inches of rain had fallen since Independence Day, and none in the 3 weeks prior to the fire. Wells and cisterns dried out. The hot prairie wind sucked the moisture from the wood and turned it to tinder. The trees shed their leaves early and lawns went brown. By October, Chicago was a desiccated husk of a city. That first week of October in 1871 was a bad one for fires. October 1st, there are 4 alarms. October 2nd, 5 more. October 3rd, another half dozen. Every day for that first week of October, the fire bell rang from the courthouse for each of the 28 significant fires that erupted in the city. The firemen and equipment were getting worn out. Repairs were needed. Steamers were breaking down. They were short on hose. Their margin for error was getting thinner and thinner. At 11 p.m., on Saturday, October 7, a fire broke out at the Lowell and Holmes planing mill. Adjacent to the mill were 2 lumber yards, a few houses, more than a few saloons, and a box factory. 3 alarms were called. The fire brigades fought that blaze for 17 hours before extinguishing it. 20 buildings were destroyed in a 4-block area bordered by Van Buren, Clinton, Adams, and the South Branch of the river. Firefighting strategy was simple at the time. Gather whatever engines were available, surround the area, pour all the water possible on the entire area, whether it was burning or not. The firemen were exhausted to the point of collapse. The era's technology forced the men to fight close to the fire. Some had suffered burns and could barely see through eyes that were red and swollen from the smoke and the cinders. That morning, more than 2 miles away from the fire, the editor of the Tribune, Horace White, examined the large cinders that had fallen around his house. Later, his Tribune would write,
"For days past, alarm has followed alarm, but the comparatively trifling losses have familiarized us to the pealing of the courthouse bell. and we have forgotten that the absence of rain for 3 weeks had left everything in so dry and inflammable a condition that a spark might start a fire which would sweep from end to end of the city.
Only a few hours later, the Tribune's warning would become a devastating truth. Sunday night, October 8, at about 9 p.m., it started in the barn owned by Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. There were 3 buildings on the O'Leary lot at 137 Ducoven Street, between the north-south streets of Jefferson and Clinton. The McLaughlin house was owned by the O'Learys and rented out for extra income. The O'Leary cottage was behind it. A small barn butted up to the alley. Besides the 5 animals in the barn, in the loft there was 3 tons of freshly delivered hay. There is no way of telling how or why the fire started. The investigation was incomplete, possibly to cover up any perceived shortcomings of the fire department. The testimony by many of the witnesses was contradictory, and the discrepancies never resolved. The investigating commission's final statement was that, whether it originated from a spark blown from a chimney on that windy night, or set on fire by some human agency, we are unable to determine. So the newspapers were determined to create a scapegoat, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow.
So the chief fire marshal, Robert Williams, stated, "The newspapers got it wrong, as usual. This isn't how the fire started. She wasn't even in the barn milking the cow. There wasn't enough room. She was outside, usually had it tied to the fence, and that's where she would milk. There was a lot of manure, a lot of dry manure that was just ready to go up in flames. And, even he stated that there was probably some people passing by and flicked a cigar butt into the manure, and it was dry and ready to go, and that's how it started. Even a neighbor, John Cokes, he said that the night before he had seen people drinking, playing cards in the alley, and it's probably them."
Once ignited, the hay and the barn went up quickly. Daniel Pegleg Sullivan reportedly gave the first alarm. All normal neighborhood activity stopped by the shouts of fire. Neighbors rushed from their homes with buckets and pots of water. The O'Learys defended their home, repeatedly pouring water over it, smothering the flames with wet blankets. In a bit of twisted fate, their home survived with little damage. Many years later, the Chicago city planners, with an immense capacity for irony, built the Chicago Fire Academy on that very spot. Quickly, the flames ran along the dry grass and leaves. It ignited the fence and their neighbor's shed. The Dalton family would be the first family made homeless by the fire. The buildings were crowded together with little space between, and the lots overbuilt with 2, 3, and 4 buildings, creating a domino effect. The strong hot wind, gusting from the southwest up to 30 miles an hour, pushed the fire north and east. A neighbor from across the street, William Lee, ran 3 blocks to Bruno Gold's drugstore to sound the fire alarm. The fire was about 15 minutes old. What followed was a series of fatal errors that set the fire free. When William Lee reaches the drugstore, he demands the key to the alarm box mounted outside the door. Bruno Gold refuses to turn it over, insisting that the fire truck had already passed. Lee has no time to argue. He runs back to his home and sees it's about to catch fire. He and his family will flee to the west with what little they could carry, and watch in horror as the fire progressed. In Bruno Gold's testimony at the official inquiry into the fire, he claimed that after Lee left the store, he triggered not 1 but 2 alarms. Strangely, neither of those signals was ever received at the central alarm office in the courthouse. In the courthouse cupola, 100 feet in the air, Watchman Matthias Schaefer scanned the city for any sign of fire. Once spotted, he would determine the location. He would then relay that location to the nearest firehouses. The giant courthouse bell would also be rung in alarm. When first seeing the smoke from Ducoven Street, Matthias dismissed it as smoldering from the previous night's fire. Several minutes later, at about 9:30, he looks back and sees flames leaping wildly into the night sky. He signaled down the speaking tube to his assistant to strike the alarm box at 3:42. This is at Canalport and Halstead. This alarm sent the fire brigades rumbling through the streets to a location a mile away from the O'Leary property. A few more minutes later, he realizes his mistake and orders a second alarm to be struck. His assistant William Brown refuses, feeling that the firemen would be confused and would ultimately find the fire anyway. The result of this stubbornness was that the fire companies closest to the fire, with their powerful pump engines, stayed at their posts. The companies that did respond lost precious minutes in a wild goose chase. One of the first reporters on the scene was a 20-year-old for the Chicago Evening Post, Joseph Chamberlain.
I was on the scene in a few minutes. The fire had already advanced a distance of about a single square through the frame buildings that covered the ground thickly north of DeKoven Street and east of Jefferson Street. If those miserable alleys shall be dignified by being denominated streets, that neighborhood had always been terra incognita to respectable Chicagoans, and during a residence of 3 years in the city, I had never visited it.
Chamberlain shows a disdain for the area that was shared by many people living in the wealthier sections of the city. This prejudice would go a long way to fixing the blame for the destruction of the city on the poor and slovenly people of DeKoven Street, specifically Mrs. O'Leary. She is a member of the dangerous classes. She became an easy target for the anti-Irish, anti-poor prejudices that were prevalent at the time. The first 2 fire brigades on the scene were America and Little Giant. Hoses were rolled out, attached to hydrants, the water turned on. Streams of water were thrown into the flame and evaporated almost as soon as they struck it. The gusty winds quickly pushed the fire out. It traveled north up Jefferson Street to Taylor Street and east towards Lake Michigan. There was no way that the fire companies could contain the blaze on 2 fronts. The firefighters held their position until the fierce heat began to singe the hair on their heads and arms. Their clothes began to smolder. By 10 p.m., the entire block was almost destroyed. 7 additional fire engines began to arrive on their own and tried to surround the fire. It was of little use. Chief Fire Marshal Robert Williams sent fireman John Dorsey to Gold's Drugstore to sound the second alarm. He pulled down the lever and headed back to the scene of the fire, not realizing that he too had made a mistake. He had forgotten to pull down the lever 4 times, which was a special signal that indicated a true second alarm. Unlike Bruno Gold's 2 phantom alarms, this alarm reached the courthouse. At the courthouse, Schaefer and Brown assumed it was another signal telling them about the original fire, and they failed to call out more engines. The firemen on the scene continued their battle. While fireman Charles Anderson doused the fire with water, a friend scavenged a door from one of the homes. Holding it like a shield against the intense heat, they moved in on the blaze. But it only took a minute for the door to catch fire. His friend dropped the door. Anderson held his ground until his clothes began to smoke. His leather helmet twisted out of shape on his head. In the South Division, 12-year-old Claire Innes and her family saw the eerie red glow to their west and dismissed it. There was no reason for them to become alarmed. They were many blocks from the fire. The river would be an impassable barrier that would protect them. Most of the city was unconcerned and went about their usual business. Horace White summed up the lack of concern.
I had retired to rest when the great bell struck the alarm, but the fires had been so frequent of late and been so speedily extinguished that I did not deem it worthwhile to get up and look at it, or even count the strokes of the bell to learn where it was.
The fire, though, was already out of control. The firemen also hoped that once it reached a broad street or a river, it would run out of fuel and burn out, but the intense heat was creating a powerful updraft. These are called convection winds.
The fire superheats the air and it rises up. This leaves a low pressure area underneath, which creates a vacuum. The cooler air near the ground gets sucked into that area from all directions. This air is turbulent. It begins to spin, twist, creating tornadoes of fire, sucking up hot embers, flaming pieces of cloth, burning wood, and hurls them many blocks away.
While the wind pushed the fire relentlessly to the north and the east, it pushed it away from the west, and with the work of 3 engine companies, the fire was stopped from spreading south and west. The firemen on the opposite front repeatedly turned to find tongues of flame licking at their backs as wind-blown cinders blew over their heads. 11 p.m., 2 hours into the fire, to the north, a strong updraft lifted up a 2-foot firebrand and flung it into the steeple of St. Paul's Catholic Church, 4 blocks behind the firemen's lines. A hook and ladder was sent to try and save the church. Other brigades leapfrogged ahead to try and cut off the fire's advance. Many of the men from Connolly Patch came over the river to watch the spectacle of the fire. An old Irish woman asked one observer what was burning. He told her it was the church. "Oh," she said cheerfully, "God will put it out." A few minutes later, the roof fell in.
In possibly the worst quirk of fate ever, in the lots adjacent to the church were a shingle factory, a box factory, a furniture company, and of all things, a match factory.
In less than 3 hours, 20 blocks crackled and roared as churches, stores, manufacturing plants, homes, shanties, barns, saloons, outhouses, railroad cars, and mills were consumed by the ravening fire. The firemen in its path were driven from corner to corner by an implacable tidal wave of flame. Often they escaped only moments before the last exit closed. By 11:30, sparks, embers, and another flaming mass flew over the river onto the new $80,000 horse stable for the Parmalee Omnibus and Stage Company at Franklin and Jackson. A burning shingle hit an open tar tank at a roofing company. A sheet of fire rushed up and within a minute spread to the adjoining coal shed at the Chicago Gas Light and Coke Company at Franklin and Adams. A lot of people made mistakes during the fire, but not Thomas Oakley, the night superintendent at the Southside Gas Works. He saw the fire across the river but didn't dismiss it. He recognized the danger. He transferred the reserve gas in the Southside reserves to the North Side, thus preventing a catastrophic explosion. The destruction of the gas works plunged the South Division into darkness, the streets bathed only by the fire's red glow. Surrounding the gas works was Connolly Patch. At about 12:30, a tenement erupted into flames. The fire gluttonously devoured the slum. Women and children rushed into the streets, screaming in terror, clutching what simple possessions they managed to grab. Many thought it was the end of the world, a cleansing of biblical proportions. Most escaped, but the fire being so fast, so unpredictable, and grown so large that a good number could not outrun the moving wall of fire that was now 1,000 feet wide and 300 feet high. It is in Connolly Patch that the death harvest began. Fireman Thomas Byrne. You couldn't see anything over you but fire. No clouds, no stars, nothing else but fire. Even the grease and oil-slicked river began to burn, igniting some of the wooden bridges. When a general alarm rang across the city which distinguished a great fire from a small one, Horace White finally got out of bed. What he discovered when he left his home was that the fire was spreading so rapidly it was only about 5 blocks from his house.
The dogs of hell were upon the housetops of LaSalle and Wells Street just south of Adams, bounding from one to another. Billows of fires were rolling over the business palaces of the city and swallowing up their contents. A column of flame would shoot up from a burning building, catch the force of the wind, and strike the next one, which in turn would perform the same direful office for its neighbor.
Claire Innes woke to a pounding on her door. Her mother yelled that the fire had gotten across the river and was coming towards them.
I could hear other voices shouting the same thing, so I went to the window. It was very bright, though not as bright as noontime as some have said. There were people everywhere. Some were going toward the fire for a better view, others away from it. A cart was stationed in front of the house, and I could see the family, father, mother, and the children, loading furniture, bags, and bundles and the like. I dressed and went downstairs. We all took a bundle and left the house, which Father bolted as if we were going on a picnic. There was fire to the west, and in places it had gotten behind the house as well, though it was still at a distance. We were to find Clark Street and take that street to the river and a bridge. The river was quite wide there, and once we were across, we would be safe, or so we were promised.
The sidewalks were jammed with people, some watching the fire, others hurrying to escape, dragging trunks, carrying bundles. The streets were clogged with horse-drawn wagons and daring pedestrians, moving slowly, fighting for space. The frantic shouts of the drivers adding to the confusion and panic. The horses neighed and screamed, maddened by the heat and noise, irritated by the falling sparks. An Iowan traveling through Chicago described her family's escape.
Our boys ran at full speed and we followed, crossing the State Street Bridge amid a shower of coals. The crowd thickened every moment. Women with babies and bundles, men with kegs of beer, all jostling, scolding, crying, or swearing.
Claire's father was at near panic, repeatedly told the children to stay close together and hurry along.
We went 2 or 3 blocks, I don't remember exactly how many. Sparks and cinders now began to fall all around us, and I saw a window awning of a house catch fire. Ahead of us there was much shouting, and then the crowd began to push back on us. Father told us to drop our bundles and hold hands, but I did not drop mine. The crowd moved forward a little, then people began turning and pushing against us, and there was no resisting the crush, and we were swept along.
The retreat was now a stampede. Claire was swept along. She felt like a leaf in a great rushing river. The wind swirled and was filled with cinders. She had to hold her hand up to her eyes to keep from being blinded by the hot ash. Suddenly, a short, tough man grabbed at her bundle.
I would not let it go. I called for Father and almost lost my bundle, except another man took hold of the first and dragged him away. When I turned, I could not find Father, or Mother, or my sisters or brothers. I ran down the sidewalk after them, calling their names and searching everywhere for a familiar face. They were gone. Into the smoke, and dark, and falling fire, I stood near the corner hoping Father or Mother would return for me and would have stayed there throughout the night, except the building up the street began to burn, and then the roof of another, and the mob came back at me, and I was once again forced to move.
At some point, Claire escaped that stream of humanity when she leaped into an alley between two shops. She looked for her family.
I looked at every face, but I could not find them. When everyone had gone by, I stood in the middle of the sidewalk and shouted for them. It was no use. Except for a few still observing the fire's approach or dragging their possessions to safety, I was alone on the street.
Joseph Chamberlain roamed the streets for hours and finally made his way to Randolph Street and the leading edge of the fire. The flames seemed to pour down the street, gobbling up building after building.
Fire was a mountain over our heads. The barrels of oil in Heath's store exploded with a sound like rattling musketry. The great north wall of the Nevada Hotel plunged inward with hardly a sound, so great the din of the surrounding conflagration. The Garden City House burned up like a box of matches. Toward the east and northeast, we looked upon a surging ocean of flame.
Even though they knew the fire was completely out of control, much of the fire department was still at work. Engines and men scattered and were operating on their own. They were trying to save anything. Anything at all. Robert Williams took an engine to one of the remaining bridge crossings and was hosing it down, keeping it open as long as possible. Building after building was crashing down. The brick may have survived the heat, but the mortar dissolved. The inner structure burned, and the walls came tumbling down. Costing more than twice its original estimated amount, the $1 million courthouse was the Chicago City Hall, the Cook County Courthouse and Jail, and the Central Fire Alarm. One written guidebook called it the homeliest building of its kind in the country. But for Chicago, it was the center of civic pride, a symbol of prosperity. When its 5.5-ton bell rang, it could be heard from one end of the city to the other. But this grand building, taller than the average, was in constant danger from the fiery winds. More than twice that Sunday night, Matthias Schaefer, along with his relief watchman Dennis Deneen, joined other men on the roof to stamp out errant fires. Even Schaefer's clothing caught fire more than once. But they were fighting against a sucker's odds. It was only a matter of time when a flaming piece of debris crashed through one of the cupola's windows. Schaefer tried, but the mushrooming flames could not be stifled. Schaefer yelled to the men on the roof to run. In the cupola, he found that the iron stairway down was already barred by smoke and fire. He was forced to slide down the banister, burning his hands and his face, scorching his whiskers in the descent. About 1:30 that Monday morning, Schaefer started the machinery in the operations room that rang the bell automatically, and then fled down to the basement jail cells to warn them that the building was on fire. They already knew. Smoke was pouring into the jail cells. The prisoners were screaming. The warden was paralyzed. He didn't know what to do. Finally, Police Captain Michael Hickey took charge. He arranged to free the prisoners, except for those charged with murder. He and his men escorted the murderers to the Northside lockup and secured them. Within 30 minutes, the bell tower collapsed. The enormous bell, tolling to the last, came crashing down with a roar that was heard a mile away over the bellowing fire. As early as 1:30 a.m., the fire crossed the river moving north. An hour later, a half-dozen more fires flared up under the storm of red rain. One by one, building by building, block by block, the fire relentlessly surged forward. The main thrust of it towards Chicago's only defense, the new waterworks. Thousands of people surged together in narrow streets, fighting to get free of the fire. Some became trapped and confused. Most stumbled their way to escape through the maze of streets and alleys, but scores of people perished when trapped in dead-end streets. Hundreds more people had no other choice but to wade into the cold waters of Lake Michigan. They would stand for hours, water to their shoulders, their backs to the fire, unable to watch the spectacle, the air almost too hot to breathe. They watched over each other, smothering the sparks as it ignited their hair and their clothing.
A newspaper reported that a woman's hair caught on fire. Her husband dunked her under water to douse it. When she came up, she begged him to drown her rather than to let her burn.
In the middle of the smoke and fire and panic was 12-year-old Claire Ennis, alone.
I ran up the street after the rest. The fire was everywhere and the crowd split up, everyone taking the route they thought safest. I followed the largest number for a block, but they scattered at every alley and turn until I decided to choose my own direction. Fire and smoke and dust were everywhere, so I ran up the street with the least of it. I was all turned around and more tired than I can ever remember being. I was choking on the smoke and dust, and I looked for a quiet place to rest. A little along the way, I came across a wide alley and went down it to an empty section filled with bricks, boards, barrels, and ladders and such.
No sooner than she sat down at the construction site, a man hurried past. Then another. A third went by and yelled something to her in German, but she didn't understand the language. When she looked to where the men had just been, she saw a wall of smoke and fire blocking the way. She was startled by how quickly the fire had appeared. She went to follow the men, but they were already gone, and before her was another wall of smoke and fire, also blocking her way. Claire was now sealed in the alley, trapped, fire coming at her from all sides. She tried to find a possible route of escape. She got within 30 feet of the smoke and was driven back.
The heat was like that of an oven. I tried to open the door to a building but found it bolted. Smoke was escaping from under the other doors, so I gave up hope of finding any safety through them.
As each of the surrounding buildings succumbed, the rain of burning embers multiplied, growing heavier, more unbearable. Claire retreated, seeking the safest, coolest place, and she found herself back at the construction site.
I cannot say I actually decided to hide behind the bricks, since I could not hear myself think in the terrible noise. I did not even look at the fire, but hid my face in the dirt and pulled my bundle over my head.
The pile of bricks that Claire hid behind shielded her from the severest heat and most of the flying debris. She had a great deal of luck on her side also. Most of the buildings that boxed her in did not collapse and never released the full wave of heat and fire. The buildings that did collapse fell far from the young girl. Time would have no meaning in this chaos. She said she lay there for many minutes, but Claire must have hid behind that pile of bricks for at least an hour before the fire lessened and she dared to peek out. She was shocked at what she saw. Sturdy brick buildings, now smoking skeletons.
My legs and arms and back were all burnt where my dress caught fire. I put out the fire and made ready to leave, which was not easy, as the openings were blocked with brick and burning wood and smoke. I called out, again and again, and at last a voice called back to me through the smoke. He told me to stand away from there, as a wall of the building might fall on me. This made me even more alarmed, but I did not want to stay in the alley alone. So I began climbing. The bricks were still hot, very hot. But I found that if I did not stop, my feet were not burnt so bad.
Claire made it to the street, but no safety was to be found. She was still surrounded by buildings that were burning and collapsing, the air pierced every so often by explosions of flammable liquids. It only spurred her on to move. She still wanted to find her family in all of this. In the North Division, the story was just beginning. Because of the prejudiced view of the time, it was thought that the better class of people would remain calm and law-abiding in the face of an emergency. Alexander Freer, a visiting New York alderman, witnessed anything but a civilized evacuation.
We tried to force our way along the avenue, which was already littered with costly furniture, some of it burning in the streets, but it was next to impossible. All the mansions were being emptied with the greatest disorder and the greatest excitement. Nobody endeavored to stay the flames now. A mob of men and women, all screaming and shouting, ran about wildly, crossing each other's paths and intercepting each other as if deranged. I saw a woman kneeling in the streets with a crucifix held up before her, the skirt of her dress burning while she prayed. We barely passed before a runaway truck dashed her to the ground.
The heat was so intense, in times in excess of 2,500 degrees, it melted iron and steel, turned stone into powder, marble and granite into lime, and made trees explode from the boiling of their own sap. Shortly after 3 a.m., a city employee sees a flaming piece of timber sailing on the wind. It narrowly misses the water tower and drops onto the water pumping station's roof. It cracks the protective slate tile. Fingers of fire pry through and begin clawing at the wood under roof. Soon the whole roof is gripped in a fist of fire. In less than an hour, the roof collapsed. The distance between the O'Leary barn and the pumping station was 2 1/3 miles. It took the fire 6 hours to travel it. Once the pump stopped working, the only water available was the so-called dead water left in the mains and in the water tower. When that was exhausted, the streams from the firemen's hoses dwindled and died. Chicago was now utterly helpless. By 6 a.m. Monday morning, the fire had raged for 9 hours. There was no end in sight. Finally, Mayor Roswell B. Mason sent urgent telegrams to the surrounding cities and towns. Chicago was in flames. Send your whole department to help us. Aid came from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Dayton, Louisville, Detroit, Port Huron, Bloomington, Springfield, Janesville, Allegheny, Pittsburgh, and many other communities. It would take hours, even days. Some cities sent steamers and ladder wagons. Others sent desperately needed hose and fresh firefighters. Some of these towns sent help at great risk to their own city. Our neighbors to the north, Milwaukee, experiencing the same drought, the same winds as we were, but they still put 3 steamers and their crews on a train, leaving only 1 working engine to protect their city. After narrowly escaping the flames the night before, Joseph Chamberlain went up Madison Street to an area that was untouched by the fire.
I had watched the greatest conflagration from its beginning to almost its end, and although the fire was still blazing all over the city with undiminished luster, I could not look at it. I was almost unable to walk with exhaustion and sought my home for an hour's sleep. As I passed up West Madison Street, I met scores of working girls on their way downtown, as usual bearing their lunch baskets as if nothing had happened. They saw the fire and smoke before them, but could not believe that their city, with their means of livelihood, had been swept away during that night.
Many of those in the North Division escaped by heading for the west and the open prairie. For others, the call was to go north. Thousands of homeless people turned and rushed towards the 230-acre Lincoln Park, the fire right at their heels.
To get to Lincoln Park, many people had to trudge through the former city cemetery. This is the area just north of the Chicago History Museum today. At the time, the graves were being relocated to cemeteries further inland. Many of the wooden grave markers burned, and people were jumping in the empty graves to escape the flames.
Later, the newspapers would point to Lincoln Park and try to cast the fire as a great leveler among the social classes. They wrote how the McCormicks and the other North Side elites were reduced to camping out on the bare ground next to the lowliest vagabond and the meanest harlot. By 11 p.m. Monday night, the fire had burned for 27 hours. 27 hours of panic and running and death. But 11 p.m. that Monday, something happened that would be later called a miracle. Mixed with the smoke and falling embers, people felt a sprinkle of water on their faces. They began shouting to each other with joy. They hugged and danced with abandon. By 3 a.m., the drizzle had turned into a downpour. The skies doing what the firemen could not. You see, that great fire would have gorged itself until it ran out of city, and then would have continued unabated its hungry march across the dry prairie if it weren't for that rain. Pockets of fire would burn for days, even months afterward, mostly in the large stores of coal. The new drama was just beginning. Nearly 100,000 people, 1/3 of the city's population, was homeless. Many, like Claire Innes, separated from their families and now searching for their loved ones. Tuesday morning, the rain woke Claire, who had collapsed from exhaustion. The first thing she did was scrounge up some food, never saying what she ate or where she got it. After eating, all she wanted to do was find her house, or what was left of it. Maybe her parents would look for her there. She didn't want to miss them. She knew no other way to find them. She wandered, trying to get her bearings, and was startled by the activity.
The streets were crowded with wagons coming and going, while people stood in groups looking at the smoking black heaps that were once houses and stores and churches. At one place I saw a woman collecting pots and pans and arranging them on a stove as if she were about to cook a meal. Next, I came upon several men gathered around a charred lump, and each man was shaking his head sadly. I did not want to think about what it might be, so I did not stop.
For many days afterward, bodies would be dug from the rubble. The corpses, or what was left of them, were laid out in rows on the floor of a makeshift morgue. 4 or 5 persons at a time were permitted to view them. Some looking for their loved ones, others just curiosity seekers. 120 bodies would be recovered, though the officials estimated some 300 people perished in the Chicago fire. Now, some of these unaccounted for fell in the river and were washed away. Alexander Freer spoke of one such soul.
The rail of the Lake Street Bridge was torn away. How many people were pushed over the bridge into the black waters? I cannot tell. I myself saw one man stumble under a load of clothing and disappear.
Entire families were believed to have been incinerated, leaving no trace of their life or even their death. The 117 bodies left unclaimed were buried at the Cook County Poor Farm and Insane Asylum at Irving Park in Narragansett, which is now Reed Dunning Memorial Park. After passing the charred corpse, Claire walked disorientated, one block after another, all looking the same, no street signs, no landmarks. Finally, after asking directions several times, she found what she was told was her block.
Everything was gone. Where our house had been was nothing but a pile of brick and ash and nothing else. I looked all around, but nothing was the same. I had hoped my parents would be waiting for me, but no one was there. There was not much I could do except stay and wait all day.
Most of Chicago was exhausted, stunned by the immensity of the carnage. Not everyone was paralyzed with shock. Some got right to work as best they could. It is said that Margaret O'Toole opened the first business in the burnt-out district, a stand selling chestnuts. As the weeks passed and the debris cooled, enterprising children dug out melted candle holders, blackened plates, fused together pieces of silverware, and sold them to tourists. There is a brisk trade in fire relics as tourists flocked to Chicago to see the carnage. That Tuesday, Clarinus sat and waited. Smoke hung in the air and made breathing difficult. Sometimes a great cloud of it would conceal everything and leave her choking. People were all around, but Claire didn't recognize anyone, and no one recognized her. Sometime during that day, she had gotten restless. She could sit no longer and began to wander down the block, but she didn't go very far. She saw a man pacing nervously. As she neared, she recognized his face. It was her father. She had been waiting in front of the wrong house all along. She learned that all of her family had survived and were staying with a generous family who had opened their doors to them. The Chicago Evening Post called it a night of horror never before equaled on the continent. The New York Tribune wrote, "Since yesterday, Chicago has gained another title to prominence. Unequaled before in enterprise and good fortune, she is now unapproachable in calamity. It was one of the great urban catastrophes in modern times. 2,100 acres swept away. Property worth $190 million destroyed. The fire cut out the heart of the city, a swath 4 miles long and almost a mile wide. In the West Division, where the fire started, 500 structures, mostly homes, were destroyed. In the South Division, 3,650 buildings destroyed, 1,600 stores, and 60 factories. Hardest hit was the North Division, the large residential district. Before the fire, there are 13,800 buildings, mostly homes. After the fire, only 500 will stand. Inside the courthouse, all the public records establishing title to every piece of real estate in Cook County went up in flames. It's only because several abstract companies saved their records that proof of property ownership was able to be established. Lost was the post office, the Chamber of Commerce building, train stations, most churches, all newspaper offices including the fireproof Tribune building. Colonel Wood was Chicago's answer to P.T. Barnum. He had a museum with 100,000 curiosities and also housed the well-regarded Globe Theater. After its destruction, the manager of the theater put out a sign that said, "Standing room only." Gone was the entire collection of the Chicago Historical Society, including an original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's walking stick. Gone most theaters, music halls, hotels. Most of these buildings consumed within minutes. Marshall Field carted off about $600,000 worth of merchandise, while another $2.5 million worth burned. Many of the sturdy bank vaults saved the cash and assets, but not all. Gone was both the old and the new Palmer House Hotel. Gone was the new $800,000 Grand Pacific Hotel just awaiting its roof. Only half of the $88 million worth of claims were paid out as insurance companies went bankrupt under the weight of the debt. Most of the survivors had little more than a story left to their name.
There are many stories about the Chicago fire. And one of the ones that comes to my mind is a guy named Isaac Arnold. He was a city founder, and he was just about to write a biography on Abraham Lincoln. And he had a giant library, thousands of books and volumes of letters written by the key figures of the Civil War. And as the fire came, he tried to save his house. So he sent his family away, but he stayed back with his house attendants, and they tried to save everything they could. They doused the house in water. They were pumping water all over everything. They were, dampening blankets to try to smother the flames. And in the end, he ran out of water. The water stopped flowing. And in an effort to save everything, he ended up saving nothing. And, if you're a Civil War buff, this is a huge tragedy.
The disaster fell most heavily on the poor. Most of them had no family or friends to lean on, no assets to draw from. They had to stand in long food lines and spend nearly every night searching for safe, dry places to sleep, often fighting off wild dogs and rats for space, water, and food.
The Aid Society's treatment of the population accentuates the class divide in Chicago. If you were poor, you had to prove that you were in need, stand in long food lines, and look for shelter. If you were well off, the Aid Society would deliver food to you. Their reasoning was that poor people were used to hardship and rich people were not.
For those who lived through it, there would always be two Chicagos, the one before the fire and the one after it. The entire history of the city would be mythologized, with the fire being its major dividing point and its principal transforming event. Chicago was a proud city, and its many boosters predicted greater glory. The New York World would take up the cry. The wonder of Chicago's original growth will be forgotten in the greater wonder of sudden new creation. But many of the fire's victims would not participate in the future glory of the city. Many of the old citizens, the city's founders, would not have the energy, drive, or time to regain their position. The city would be in the hands of a new generation. Men such as Marshall Field, Potter Palmer, George Pullman. The first phase of Chicago's reconstruction lasted over 2 years and resulted in the rebuilding of the burnt-out area and the recharging of the economy. The trains still ran to Chicago. The city still had the majority of its shipping capacity. The year after the fire, the stockyards handled twice as many hogs as the year before the fire. By March of 1872, even after an unusually harsh winter, Chicago had nearly 20 miles of frontage of stone and brick buildings, and tens of thousands of smaller buildings completed or under construction. But the city immediately after the fire looked a lot like the city before the fire. In the rush to build, the contractors relied on the same practices they always used. Some buildings were started before the blueprints were even completed. The city council enacted few new fire regulations. It would take another fire in the summer of 1874, one that would sweep away 812 buildings in an 18-block area on the southern edge of the business district. This Little Chicago fire would cause insurance companies to force the city council to enact stiffer fire regulations. The fire happened at the perfect time in history as exciting technological revolutions like the floating foundation, K-sound foundations, and the steel frame were happening in architecture. And an inventive young group of architects like Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, William Jenney, John Root built the city of their dreams, the first skyscrapers, a vertical city. And the city would grow through that never-ending process of renewal called progress, done with a uniquely Chicago style. The business district was rebuilt, except that it was a little larger and a few stories taller. a little larger, and a few stories taller. A little larger, and a few stories taller. Until we get the city we have today. Imperfect as it is, one of the great cities, not just of America, but of the world.
Last night, when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary left the lantern in the shed, and when the cow kicked it over, she winked her eye and said, "It'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. Hot time in the old town tonight. Fire, fire, fire late last night when we were all in bed. Mrs. O'Leary left a lantern in the shed, and when the cow kicked it over, she winked her eye and said, "It'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. Hot time in the old town tonight. Fire, fire, fire."